Christine Jessup was a 9-year-old girl from Queensville, a small village about an hour north of Toronto, Canada. She was a happy fourth grader who loved school and sports. Basically, your typical North American kid in the 1980s. On October 3rd, 1984, Christine arrived home from school to an empty house. That afternoon, her mother and brother were away visiting her father, leaving Christine on her own. When her family returned, they found Christine's school bag on the counter, but no sign of Christine. By evening, the worried family called the police and a search began for the missing girl. Days of searching turned into weeks with no trace of Christine. As the weeks passed, hopes of finding her alive began to fade. Then, on December 31st, 1984, nearly 3 months after she disappeared, a farmer discovered Christine's remains in a field about 30 miles from her home. She had been subject to a brutal and indecent assault, a horrible, tragic fate that shocked the entire nation. Christine was laid to rest a week later, on January 7th, 1985, in the cemetery behind her family's home. Under pressure to solve the crime, investigators quickly focused on the Jessup's neighbor, 24-year-old Guy Paul Morin. In February 1985, Christine's mother remarked to police that Morin was known as a quote-unquote weird neighbor, which put him on their radar. Police surveilled Morin and brought him in for questioning on February 22, 1985. He cooperated fully. During a lengthy interview, Morin maintained his innocence and even volunteered hair, blood, and saliva samples. Clearly, these weren't the actions of a guilty man being accused of literally the worst crime imaginable. He said nothing incriminating during the interrogation, yet on April 22, 1985, the cops clapped the cuffs on Morin and charged him with Christine's slaying. Morin's first trial began in January 1986, and prosecutors relied on circumstantial evidence. So-called experts testified that hairs and fibers from the crime scene matched Morin's and could have come from his home or car. Further, 2 jailhouse snitches claimed Morin had confessed while in custody. The defense pointed to Morin's solid alibi and argued that the forensic evidence was misinterpreted and weak. In February 1986, the jury agreed, and Morin was acquitted of the slaying. However, this was not the end of the story, not by any means. The prosecution appealed the acquittal, and a higher court ordered a retrial. In 1992, at Morin's second trial, the prosecution repeated much of the same evidence and also presented new witnesses. These witnesses described Morin's behavior around the time of the crime as quote-unquote suspicious, and this time the jury was persuaded. On July 30th, 1992, Guy Paul Morin was found guilty. For many in the community, the verdict brought relief that the perpetrator had been caught and a sense that justice had been served. But in reality, an innocent man was now behind bars, and the true perpetrator remained at large and would remain so for decades. In fact, the actual perpetrator would eventually die a free man, though not of natural causes. A major problem in the case was the misuse of forensic evidence. With DNA testing not yet available, the prosecution leaned heavily on hair and fiber analysis to implicate Morin. The forensic experts gave the impression that a hair and some fibers definitively linked Morin to the crime, but this was highly misleading. In reality, such evidence is far from conclusive. Hair and fiber quote-unquote matches are not unique and could easily be due to coincidence or contamination. What sounded like solid scientific proof was actually quite weak. Investigators also succumbed to tunnel vision, fixating on Morin as the prime suspect and overlooking other possibilities. Once Morin was in their sights, they interpreted every detail as evidence of his guilt and neglected to pursue other leads. The reliance on literal jailhouse snitches further compounded the error. These informants' worthless testimony, alleging he confessed in jail, was false, yet it was used in court and helped convict him. It was advances in DNA technology that finally unraveled the miscarriage of justice. In 1995, forensic scientists were able to extract a DNA profile from biological evidence that had been preserved since 1984. The DNA results proved that the biological material didn't come from Guy Paul Morin. Armed with this new evidence, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned the conviction on January 23, 1995, fully exonerating him. Prosecutors publicly apologized for the miscarriage of justice and for all that Morin had endured. He also later received $1.25 million from the Ontario government as compensation for his ordeal. Given the gravity of the offense he was falsely convicted of, this seems somewhat insufficient. That said, Morin, who had spent 18 months behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, was now a free man. With the once convicted perpetrator fully and completely vindicated, the focus returned to finding the real person responsible. In 1995, Toronto police set up a special task force to re-examine the case, and they interviewed hundreds of potential suspects. Despite these efforts, no arrest was made. The trail eventually went cold, and for the next 25 years, Christine's slaying remained an unsolved cold case. After more than 3 decades, the truth finally emerged. In October 2020, Toronto police announced that DNA and genetic genealogy had identified Calvin Hoover as the perpetrator. Hoover had been 28 years old in 1984 and was a friend of the Jessup family. Hoover had never been publicly suspected during the original investigation. By the time he was identified, Hoover had consensually and intentionally eliminated the prime suspect all by himself back in 2015. However, detectives obtained a sample of his blood from the coroner's office and confirmed it matched the DNA found on Christine's clothing. Unfortunately, while Hoover would never face justice in a courtroom, there was finally closure for the Jessup family after decades of waiting. On a cold night in October 1992, the community of Sunderland in northeastern England was shaken by the disappearance of a 7-year-old girl named Nikki Allen. Nikki lived with her mother and siblings in a council flat, a type of subsidized public housing, in a neighborhood struggling with significant poverty. When she failed to return home after visiting her grandparents' apartment nearby, alarm spread quickly. Dozens of friends and neighbors joined an urgent overnight search, scouring the streets and derelict buildings around the docks for any sign of the girl. The massive search effort ended in tragedy the next morning. Nikki's small shoes and her coat were found abandoned outside a boarded-up building known as the Old Exchange. Inside the empty building's basement, searchers discovered the girl's body. I'll spare you the details here for your own sanity, but disturbingly, Nikki was subject to extreme cruelty. Police immediately cordoned off the Old Exchange and combed the area for clues. Forensic specialists collected blood evidence, as well as a brick used in the attack. The initial findings painted a picture of a frenzied assault, putting intense pressure on detectives to swiftly find the person responsible. Northumbria police investigators quickly zeroed in on a suspect, 24-year-old George Heron, a local man who lived in the same apartment complex as Nikki's family. Several pieces of circumstantial evidence pointed to Heron. A knife matching the presumed weapon was reportedly found in his home, and spots of blood were discovered on his clothes and shoes. Witnesses also recalled seeing a young man resembling Heron walking with a little girl near the Old Exchange on the night of the attack. Taken together, these clues made Heron a prime suspect in the eyes of the police. Under enormous public pressure to solve the case, detectives brought George Heron in for questioning. He was interrogated intensively over 3 days and denied any involvement more than 100 times. As the hours wore on, officers resorted to aggressive tactics that a judge would later condemn as oppressive. Eventually, after this marathon of leading questions and psychological pressure, Heron buckled and confessed to slaying Nikki Allen. That confession, however coerced it might have been, became the cornerstone of the case against him. In 1993, George Heron stood trial for Nikki's slaying. The prosecution relied heavily on the taped confession, alongside the slim physical evidence linking him to the crime. But as the trial unfolded at Leeds Crown Court, the judge took a hard look at how that confession had been obtained. It became clear that Heron's admissions were made under extreme duress and were unreliable. The judge ruled the confession inadmissible due to the police's heavy-handed tactics. With that key piece of evidence thrown out, the case against Heron collapsed. Lacking solid proof, the jury found him not guilty, and he was acquitted of Nikki Allen's slaying. Heron's acquittal was a devastating blow for Nikki's family. Many local residents were outraged, convinced that a guilty man had walked free on a technicality. George Heron, fearing vigilante retaliation, left Sunderland after the trial and went into hiding under a new identity. Meanwhile, police publicly stated that they had no other suspects, likely because they had zeroed in on the supposed culprit right away. In fact, officers told Nikki's distraught mother that they were not looking for anyone else in connection with the crime. The investigation had effectively hit a dead end. In the eyes of the authorities and the family, the confession being thrown out allowed the guilty party to escape. Little did they know that it was a wrongful focus on an innocent man that had let the real perpetrator slip away. With the case unsolved, years began to pass. For the rest of the 1990s and well into the 2000s, Nikki Allen's slaying remained a cold case, effectively shelved since the cops thought they lost their chance to get their man. Yet her mother, Sharon Henderson, refused to let her daughter be forgotten, and refused to let the case be as cold as it officially was at that point. She embarked on a relentless quest for justice, hounding the authorities to revisit her daughter's case and appealing to anyone who would listen. At times, the police dismissed her persistence, and Sharon felt she was being treated as a nuisance rather than a grieving mother, but she never gave up pushing for answers. Sharon let the cops know she wouldn't stop being a thorn in their side until Nikki's case was solved and the perpetrator was locked up. Finally, a breakthrough came a quarter-century later. In 2017, spurred by Sharon's incessant campaigning, Northumbria police agreed to conduct a full cold case review of the evidence using modern forensic techniques. Crucially, forensic technology had advanced dramatically since 1992. Investigators applied new DNA profiling methods to Nikki's clothing and other preserved evidence. The results provided the lead that had been missing for so long. DNA from the crime scene matched another individual, someone who had been noted, but hadn't been properly investigated in the original investigation. That DNA match pointed to David Boyd, a name that had been on the periphery of the case decades earlier. Boyd was 25 years old in 1992 and had lived in the same housing block as Nikki, just a few doors away. He was actually the boyfriend of one of Nikki's babysitters, meaning he was known to the family, and, as the evidence would show, likely to Nikki herself. More alarmingly, it turned out that David Boyd had a history of predatory behavior toward kids. He had prior convictions for indecent assault and other incidents involving young girls, both before and after 1992. In hindsight, he fit the profile of a likely culprit, but in the chaos of the investigation and the focus on one man, he was somehow overlooked. Armed with this new evidence, police moved quickly. In April 2018, detectives arrested the then 52-year-old David Boyd for Nikki Allen's slaying. A comprehensive reinvestigation followed, this time piecing together all the clues that had been missed. Investigators discovered that back in 1992, Boyd had given a false alibi about his whereabouts on the night Nikki died, an alibi that fell apart under renewed scrutiny. They also learned that Boyd closely matched the eyewitness descriptions of the man seen with Nikki. In short, many red flags that should have been noticed originally were finally recognized, strengthening the case against Boyd to an even greater degree. In April 2023, David Boyd finally went on trial for the slaying of Nikki Allen. Prosecutors presented a chilling narrative of what happened on that October night in 1992. They argued that Boyd had lured the 7-year-old away from her home, taking her toward the derelict waterfront building with a sinister intent. When Nikki screamed or tried to escape, Boyd reacted with brutal violence. One witness back then recalled seeing Nikki happily skipping to keep up with a man as they walked. This suggested she went with him willingly, likely because she knew and trusted him due to her being the boyfriend of one of her babysitters. Boyd's defense maintained that the case was circumstantial and that there was no direct forensic proof that he had actually slain Nikki. They even offered an extremely implausible excuse for the incriminating DNA, suggesting it might have gotten on Nikki's clothes by accident. Unsurprisingly, this disgusting attempt to evade responsibility didn't sway the jury. The DNA link, combined with the many other pieces of evidence tying Boyd to the crime, left little room for doubt. After a trial 3 decades in the making, the jury took only a couple hours of deliberation to find David Boyd guilty of Nikki Allen's slaying. In May 2023, a judge sentenced Boyd to life in prison for the offense, with a minimum of 29 years to be served behind bars. Given his age, this means he will likely spend the rest of his life in custody. For Sharon Henderson, who had fought for most of her adult life to see justice for her daughter, the moment was bittersweet. There was relief in finally seeing the real perpetrator convicted, but also anguish that it had taken 30 years to reach this point. Notably, an apology from Northumbria Police followed. The force acknowledged the grievous errors of the original investigation and formally apologized to George Herron for wrongfully accusing him and to Nikki's family for the decades of delay. That said, an apology is cold comfort when their investigation let a monster stalk the streets for almost 3 decades, committing additional offenses in the meantime. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, merch store, and other channels. Just click the links in the description below. On March 29, 1975, 16-year-old Sharon Pryor left her home in Montreal's Pointe Saint Charles neighborhood to meet friends at a local pizzeria. It was a Saturday evening on Easter weekend, and Sharon headed out around 7 p.m., expecting a fun night with her boyfriend and her pals. She never arrived at the restaurant. By 11 p.m., when Sharon still hadn't returned home, her worried mother, Yvonne Pryor, reported her missing and launched a frantic search with police and neighbors. For 3 days, family and volunteers combed the area, clinging to hope that Sharon might be found safe. Unfortunately, their worst fears were realized in the most horrific way. 3 days after her disappearance, on April 1, 1975, Sharon's body was discovered in a wooded, vacant lot in Lingueuil, a city just across the St. Lawrence River from Montreal. Sharon's body bore clear signs of a brutal attack, and she had been subjected to horrors beyond comprehension. A men's blue t-shirt had been used to bind or restrain her, indicating she struggled against her attacker. Nearby in the snow, police noted distinctive tire tracks, suggesting the perpetrator used a vehicle to dump her body and flee. Montreal police and their counterparts in Linguail now had an extremely disturbing act on their hands that would haunt them for decades. From the outset, detectives worked round the clock to track down the perp. They did catch a potentially crucial break early on. Around the same time Sharon vanished, another young woman had a terrifying encounter on the very same street. This 22-year-old woman reported that a tall man with a knife tried to force her into a car, but she managed to escape. This attempted kidnapping occurred within blocks of where Sharon was last seen, only minutes apart in time. The shaken victim described her assailant as an English-speaking white male, about 30 years old, tall with blue eyes, brown hair, and a mustache. Police suspected this was not a coincidence. It sounded like the same predator who had abducted Sharon. They now had a rough description of a suspect, and it matched the general profile of many men in 1970s Montreal, but still, it was a starting point. Investigators collected whatever physical evidence they could from Sharon's body in the crime scene. The t-shirt used to tie her was taken into evidence, as were scrapings and swabs from her clothing and body. In 1975, however, DNA profiling was unheard of, and forensic science hadn't yet advanced to the point of identifying a person by genetic fingerprints. Detectives were largely limited to old-fashioned police work, interviewing local suspects, checking alibis, and comparing the witnesses' description against known criminals. They plastered the neighborhood with missing posters and pleas for information. Despite these efforts, the case quickly proved stubborn. The physical evidence yielded no immediate leads, and the attacker's identity remained a mystery. Weeks turned into months with no arrests. Over the years, authorities interrogated scores of potential suspects. Tips poured in about suspicious characters in the area, and cops didn't ignore any of them. In fact, law enforcement would end up investigating more than 100 individuals in connection with Sharon's slaying. Some were local troublemakers who people just had a hunch about, while others were known offenders or violent criminals who vaguely fit the profile. Yet none of those leads panned out, and not a single arrest was made. By the late 2010s, DNA technology had advanced by leaps and bounds. Techniques like genetic genealogy had begun cracking cold cases that once seemed virtually unsolvable. In 2019, the authorities decided it was time to apply these cutting-edge tools to Sharon Pryor's case. They submitted the preserved crime scene samples, including genetic material recovered from that men's t-shirt and from Sharon's clothing, to a laboratory in the States. Specifically, the evidence was sent to a lab that could perform enhanced DNA analysis and search genealogical databases for potential matches. This was a long shot since the samples were decades old and degraded. There was no guarantee of finding any relatives of the person, but it was the best hope yet for a breakthrough. For a few years, the scientific work continued behind the scenes. Then, in June 2022, the lab hit pay dirt. The DNA profile from the crime scene indicated a connection to a particular family name, Romine. In other words, by tracing genetic markers in public databases, analysts found distant relatives whose family tree included this rather rare surname. Armed with the name, detectives dug into their records and soon identified a potential suspect who had never been on their radar before: Franklin Romine. Romine was an American man from West Virginia who happened to be living in Montreal during the 1970s. In fact, the police learned that Romine had known listed addresses in both Montreal and Linguail around 1975. That immediately raised eyebrows, since those were the two cities encompassing Sharon's abduction and the location where her body was found. What investigators uncovered about this suspect was extremely alarming. He was no ordinary American who had taken up residence in Montreal. He was a fugitive from justice from one of the worst crimes imaginable. Born in 1946, Romine started committing crimes early, and by age 18, he was already attempting to escape from prison. Notably, in February 1974, Romine was arrested for indecent assault in Parkersburg, West Virginia. While awaiting trial, he was released on a low bond and promptly fled to Canada. By early 1975, Romine was living freely in Montreal under the noses of local authorities. This timeline was almost too perfect to be coincidence. Here was a man accused of a similar heinous offense who arrived in Montreal just in time for Sharon Pryor's slaying. Detectives also found that Romine's attributes lined up uncannily well with the clues from 1975. He was a white male in his late 20s at the time, tall and apparently often wore a mustache, just as the attempted abduction witness had described. Romine even owned a car while he was in Montreal, and they were able to pull the records from an old government database. When police checked docs on that vehicle, they found that its tire size and treads were likely compatible with the unidentified tire tracks at the crime scene. It looked like the cops were about to get their man, but there was a catch. Franklin Romine was no longer around to confront. In fact, police discovered that he had died back in 1982 at age 36, reportedly in the Montreal area. To be absolutely certain that Romine was their man, investigators would have to literally dig up the past. The DNA extracted from Romine's exhumed bones was compared to the crime scene DNA from 1975. The result came back unequivocal. It was a perfect match. This confirmed beyond any doubt that Franklin Romine was the man responsible for the vicious slaying of Sharon Pryor. The investigation's final stages also revealed a grim but ironic twist. Romine had almost been caught at the time of the attack, but for a different crime. Just a few months after Sharon's March 1975 slaying, Canadian authorities arrested Franklin Romine in October 1975. If DNA technology had been what it is today, Romine would have been shackled up for the attack on Sharon right then and there. But sadly, that wasn't the case. He was extradited back to the U.S. in early 1976 and stood trial for the Parkersburg attack. He was convicted the same year, but the case was overturned in 1980 on a technicality. Romine thus never really faced serious justice for any of the sick and twisted acts he committed. Under circumstances which remain unclear, he was able to slip back into Canada in 1981, where he died the following year. It remains unknown whether he offended again, either in the US or Canada, and it's unclear to what extent this has been researched by investigators thus far.